Okay, so normally I just start showing you the hike and everything, but I thought I would share just a few thoughts. This is mostly geared to those of you who are absolute beginners and who, when you think of a mountain, you're like, oh my God, I can't do that. That's just way, like, you must be Superman. And it's like, no, I'm not. Excuse me, I was eating some peanuts, and because I usually try to eat a little before I start the hike. You burn thousands of calories. Here's my thing. I just wanted to share with you, this is Mount Baldy Register Ridge, and the hike itself is hard. It is monstrous. This is one of the harder short hikes, I would call it. It's hard and short in that it's not going to last as long as the Cucamonga hike, but it is... Oh, that's my map guidance. Anyway, my point is, though, when I wake up and when I think about doing it, I don't want to do it either. I feel exactly as I did back when I was that little fat kid who was afraid of pushing himself. It feels exactly to me the way it feels to those of you who are beginners. It feels exactly to me the way it feels to you. And that is, I'm afraid. I don't want to. I know it's going to kick my ass. Not only that, but I'm kind of sore from my workouts. So I'm like, oh my God, I don't think I'm going to make it. And so what do I do to convince myself?
Euclid Avenue for 3 miles.
Those days when you don't want to go out there for a run, and I hate running. You might want to try like me and just say, you know what, just let's put on the shoes. Let's go out there just 100 yards. That's what I'm telling myself right now. In my heart, I don't want to do this. I don't. But then there's the other guy inside of me that also says, this is awesome. So it's not just one voice. There's many voices inside of me. One says, oh my God, I don't want to do this. I don't want to, this is... Yeah, there is that voice. Believe me, and he's screaming loud right now. But there's the other guy who's like, just a couple 100 yards. And if we can't handle it, we'll turn back. And I know what's going to happen. I actually know. I'm not. I'm going to go and I'm going to start to like it. And even though it's going to start to get painful and it's going to start to mess with me, at some point, my feeling of progress, my desire to move forward, will far outstrip whatever pain and fear I feel. So I hope that helps, okay? Let's get going. That's the starting point. Let's get started. This is the guest book, I guess. Here's where our first split between the paths happens. The easy road is that way. This is the kill road. Let's get started. Oh, bye-bye, easy road. I just started Register Ridge about 2 minutes ago. And like I said, it's the incline. Most people, when they do Baldy, they take that easier road that I showed you. It's longer, but it's easier. I would not recommend take this. Take the easier one. This, I guess you could do it even if you're a beginner. You'll just have to go very slow and take regular breaks. The temperature is, I think, 69, 68 degrees. Maybe 66. But trust me, with the sun and my sweat, it feels like 90. But look behind me. And every time I look up, all that stuff up there looks like it's far away. And I tell you this to remind you, like I said, it does. And I'm like, I can't do it. I'm not going to make it. That's just stupid. But that little voice just tells me, just take a few more steps. Don't look up. Just put one step in front of the other. One step. That's all. Don't worry about the top. Worry about the next step. And we'll see how far we get. Now that I'm starting some of this challenging, but I thought I'd talk to you about something that is my passion, which is diabetes. So let me go ahead and explain something.
A few years ago, while doing research at a hospital, I found an unusually high percentage of diabetics in my data. Now, at first, I didn't pay much attention to it since hospitals might have more diabetics than the rest of the population. But once my study concluded, I decided to look into it a little deeper. So I got a glucose monitor and I stood on a nearby street corner and I offered people free glucose tests. Now, over the next month, I tested over 1,000 people. And of the non-diabetic adults over 40, more than half had blood sugar high enough to be considered diabetic. Now, to give you some perspective, the prevalence of diabetes in the United States amongst the same age group is about 10%. So my numbers were nearly 5 times that. Now, to be fair, street glucose testing is not as accurate as a clinical test. But even if the number was 1/3 of that, it would still mean that about 20% of the people were walking around with diabetes without even knowing it. This is telling me something really troubling about diabetes in some of the local population.
So remember, if you haven't had a test, you don't want to be like the population, like I said. That was a lot of people. That's a lot of people with diabetes who don't know it. Do you see? This is an important problem.
But it's more than just numbers. I remember a conversation I had with this woman who came to the hospital to visit her dad. She was professional, well-spoken, and unusually tall. Yet when she would speak about her dad, she sounded like a little 4-year-old looking up to her big, tall guardian. In her eyes, he was still the protector who would banish the monsters from under her bed. She told me that her dad didn't know he had diabetes till he got sick a couple of years ago. And now, that morning, her dad had just undergone his second amputation. And when we moved him from the stretcher to the bed, he was just a shadow of himself. Imagine, diabetes had taken both his legs and wasted his body so much that what remained of him could barely fit in a baby's crib. And I guess I just think of the loss. Just because he didn't know he had diabetes till it was too late.
2 miles. And that was in an hour, 19 minutes. That's an hour, 19 minutes, 2 miles. 2,000 feet climbed. So it's tiring. Yeah. 53-minute pace. So I've really slowed down. The gigantic rocks.
So let's review a bit. Now, normally, most folks get diagnosed with diabetes after a doctor's visit. But in my research, I found a lot of folks who didn't know they had diabetes till they ended up in the ER with fever, chills, and other symptoms of illness. Now, this was usually because they were either hyperglycemic or worse, suffering from ketoacidosis. This meant that on average, these folks had already been diabetic for about 5 to 8 years longer than folks who were diagnosed before they got symptoms. In other words, most other people. Now think about that for a bit. What do you think this is telling you about some of the people in the population?
I'm already burned out. It's about 3,000 feet. It's kind of cold, probably in the 50s. There is a little bit of snow.
The problem is that there's too many people, too many thousands of people who have diabetes but do not know it until they end up in the ER. And this is bad for 2 reasons. One, high blood sugar is destructive, and every year that you have it, it corrodes your capillaries, veins, your nerves, and your eyes. This means more kidney damage, more blindness, more amputations, and more death. And number 2, the cost for the community is higher because these folks have to use the ER, which is between 5 and 10 times more expensive than a regular doctor's visit. Many folks are low income or on Medicare and unable to pay their bills, which means the state pays for the bills. This adds millions to our healthcare costs. So, what can we do about this problem? Well, before I could answer that question, I needed to break down my population further because the problem was much worse for men than for women. When I asked men, I found many reasons, but the top three were: first, that they felt fine and that they didn't need to seek care, something about being weak. And second, that they don't have the money or insurance for a doctor. And third, that they hate waiting in lines and losing a day of work without pay. Women, on the other hand, didn't seem to have the same problems seeking medical care, though a few told me they didn't have the money or the time to take off from work. Now, as a group, I found the top two reasons people didn't get regular exams were a fear that the hospital would actually make things worse, and complaints about the confusing medical bureaucracy. For example, I'd heard horror stories from many of my informants telling me how after visiting the doctor or hospital that they actually got sicker or knew a relative who got worse or died. This belief of hospitals as twisted institutions that cause illness was very common. Now, second, folks would also tell me how their first visit to a hospital was a massive waste of time and money. Over and over, I'd hear how my informants would seek care only to be sent from one clinic to another and then another. And once they were at the right place, how they'd be asked confusing questions and be made to wait for hours for every step of the procedure. And then, let's not even get started with all the problems with insurance, which many didn't have. Many would tell me how they lost days just getting care, and because they had terrible jobs, they didn't even get paid for their time off. So to summarize, men avoid care until it's too late, in part because of macho culture, while both sexes avoid care because of misconceptions about hospitals and the true problem of hospital bureaucracy. So how do we reduce this problem?
4 miles. I'm almost there. See, there's the first victory pole. Oh, it always feels so tough, that last 100 yards. Those last 100 yards. And here we are. The signs. And here's the mountaintop sign. We made it. Cucamonga Peak. The other mountains there. If you're looking far in the distance over there, that's Santiago Peak. It's not that tall, it's 5,600 feet. But wow, look at how it looks here in the scenery. Out there is upland, and out there is towards LA. And that's where we're headed on our way back. So, like I said, there's some parts with snow, but this is not anywhere near as hard as it was when we were going on Cucamonga. But still a good idea. Get your poles. Wow, that was a hole.
The problem is larger than you might imagine. There was a time when I was asked to translate between a nurse and the mother of a 12-year-old girl. A few years prior, this girl suffered a broken leg and gained about 50 pounds during her recovery. Her mother explained that the last time her daughter was in the hospital, she wasted so many hours waiting for treatment that she lost her job. The mother didn't bring the daughter back until her daughter got really sick with a fever. And apparently, she was suffering a hyperglycemic episode. This was when the mother learned her 12-year-old daughter had type 2 diabetes. I was actually surprised because children that young don't usually get type 2 diabetes, but the doctor's diagnosis left no doubt. What was hardest, though, was feeling this mother's pain while translating her words. Watching her daughter in a coma and not knowing whether she would survive. I can't imagine the guilt-induced torment that this woman was going through, even though I saw it. Now the thing is, this was totally preventable if she'd visited the doctor early. Even her weight gain was a side effect of some of the medications and could have been mitigated. Now I know some folks might judge the mother harshly, and to some degree, I think she already feels that burden. But rather than satisfy our own selfish urges playing the blame game, is there anything we can do to reduce the chance of this happening? Well, 2 ideas came to mind. First, I found that men who were in relationships were more likely to get doctor's checkups because the women in their lives would remind them of how important it was to the entire family. Whenever I checked a man, I spent more time speaking with his girlfriend or wife about this in hopes that she would encourage him to do it. I also found that explaining both the dangers of inaction and giving them information to get checked without much hassle got more guys to tell me they would get checked. Now, did they go? Well, I didn't have the time nor the resources to dig into that further, but the few folks who came back to thank me is promising. A second solution stems from my own independent research, and that is to go out to populated places and offer to screen folks. Now, this is a controversial thing to do because most of you are not doctors, and some of you might need to train at least a little on how to do glucose tests. But both of these things are problems that can be resolved with a little bit of education. I could explain more if there's an interest, but hopefully this is simple enough. The important thing is that you are doing things to get more folks to learn of their own health status, and it is relatively simple. It's so simple that I did it again. After my initial test near the hospital, I went to another city a few months later and tested more folks. My data there was almost exactly the same, but what was more important was that by talking to people and raising awareness of the screening, I was able to get more of them to see their doctor, and many even came back to thank me for opening their eyes. One young man who was barely 30 told me he never thought diabetes would be a problem till I tested him and found he was over 250. When he came back to thank me, I explained that the best way to do that is to talk to other guys in his group and do whatever he can to get them tested. Since he got a glucometer from his doctor, I showed him how he can do that. Another one was a mother who I tested and found her glucose was 300, while her husband was 255. When she came back from the doctor, she thanked me and brought more family members, and 2 of them tested over 250. I then explained how she can test her friends and family. I explained how walking, hiking, just like I'm doing here, and running can help. Even though sometimes it seems hard, the hardest part is often just getting out the door.
So I'm a little less than a mile away, and unlike the other longer trails, I guess it's because they're so long. This one is it's going to be an 8-mile hike by the time I'm done, and in some ways it actually even feels like maybe it wasn't as hard as even Cucamonga, just because Cucamonga had more miles. This is 8, and the other one was bordering on 14, 15 miles. Just in sheer miles, that's a lot. So that alone is probably a factor. But it's still, this one is just the intensity. Going up that ridge, whoa.
To summarize, there are many people in communities like mine who are suffering with diabetes but do not know it. The numbers suggest they are much more than we think, but not enough energy is going into identification and treatment, even though this benefits both them and us as a society. I think we need to take more proactive steps and show these folks that hospitals and clinics aren't some sort of medieval torture chambers or DMV offices. Sometimes a simple glucose test can open their eyes and save hundreds or thousands of lives. Not only that, but those of us who are fans of exercise and working out can do our part by inviting these folks to walk, hike, or run. We can share our own experiences with beginning exercise, including the fact that we don't need to spend hours. We can go on a 20-minute walk once in a while, or we can go for a nice jog without trying for a world's record. The important point is that we open their eyes to a few simple things that they can do. And maybe we can bring those terrible numbers down.
So this thing is a real butt kicker. And we are done.
Okay, so it is just a little after 7:25 and the hike is done. It was 8.25 miles in 4 hours 57:16. It felt less murderous this time, but I think it was because I didn't push myself to the same intensity that I have when I was going with my student. I admire my student. She makes me go just a little harder. But at the same time, it's really hard to push yourself any harder because the steepness is just, like I said in one of my talks, which is that when you got that steepness, if you push just a little bit harder, you go just a tiny bit faster. It's not almost not noticeable, but your heart rate goes up by almost 5 beats for every tiny bit you want. So all of a sudden, you're going 10 beats more. And my problem is maybe my fitness is just going down. I don't know. We'll check. I also hope that you found our discussion on diabetes educational. If you like the way I'm covering it this way, I thought it would be a cool idea because I've seen kids do the let's play things, and I'm like, well, let's do it. Let's hike and educate ourselves a little about some important subjects. So I hope that did help you out, and I hope it motivates you to get yourself checked. Okay? Okay, thanks, and take care.